Thank you for that kind introduction. So as mentioned, topic today is how to scale your product. And I have put in parentheses with an exit in mind, because I think the emphasis here really is as you scale your product, as it grows and becomes successful, the exits will come naturally. So the focus needs to be not the exit, but how you really scale. Just quick way, though the introduction was pretty suffice, has spent a long time in investing many various different asset classes, treasury, debt, futures, was actually in another venture capital fund called Learn Capital when I ended up making an investment into a small, very early stage startup in Croatia called Photomath. And they're based out of Zagreb. That turned into a fun, wild ride over the next 7 to 8 years. We ended up growing the company from 0 revenue and a few million in users, all the way up to 500 million plus downloads, tens of millions of dollars in revenue, and then eventually sold that off to Google. After selling to Google, stayed there with the integration of the team, and then moved back into the investing side where I'm at GSV Ventures. But most of my talk is really going to focus around my time at Photomath and what it took to help scale that company. And then a little bit, because I'm a VC, want to start off with actually giving context in the space, right? So one of the things that's really critical is that, look, the ability to start and grow a company has never been easier. And you can kind of see this. This is a global trend. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the US, India, pick a market. The number of startups that have exist have pretty much doubled, or in the case of, India, like 10x plus in the last 10 years or so, right? And that's really because of a couple different trends. And these trends are not new. I'm sure you've all heard this, right? There's basically a lower cost and faster time to launch. The lower cost is coming things from cloud infrastructure development. You basically need less hardware purchases, instant scalability, cost reductions, leaner operations, smaller teams, and raising the ubiquity of open source building blocks, APIs, no-code ecosystems. All this stuff has probably been discussed ad nauseum for like the last 5 years. But there's still more, right? And the latest and greatest of these trends is vibe coding. I'm sure you guys have also seen this, which is TechCrunch, the latest batch of startups. 25% of them said over 90% of their coding was essentially generated by AI. You see from HubSpot, the amount of time that it takes to produce and to write code is also dropping drastically, right? So now you can even think about the next iteration of that, which is not just AI-generated assisted coding, but also vibe coding, right? Natural language ability to just say, hey, I'm a great product manager. I understand my user experience. Now I can get a product out in market much faster, and not necessarily with the same huge dev team that I needed to in the past. So what does that also mean? We're talking about unprecedented scale. Right? If you look at this chart in the past, sorry, it's not great quality, but you can see historically, it often took people to get to 100 million users, 7 years, then 4 years, maybe 3 years. Uber, it took over 5 years to get to 100 million users. TikTok did it incredibly fast at like 9 months, and the latest iteration of that is Thread, which took a total of 5 days, right, to get to 100 million users. So the expectations for scale and the ability for scale, again, unprecedented right now in terms of how quickly this is starting to happen. And that also means that there are it's a crowded landscape. There are a lot of apps in the App Store. A lot of people, it's easier to produce something, to get it into market, get feedback, and to start scaling. So if you look at just how many apps there were in the App Store, and on the Apple side, it has increased to about 5 million. And so I think the question becomes, as you think about scaling your product, how do you differentiate? Like, what do you do in this market, right? So this kind of like, okay, great. Now you spent the last 5 minutes talking to me about how the market is growing really fast. Everybody can do it, and it's super competitive. How am I going to think about getting to scale? And I think in these situations, when things are incredibly disruptive, the key is to go back to your first principles, and that's know your users, right? Making sure that you fundamentally are creating really like solving someone's problem or really fitting and using their need and creating an exceptional amount of value is the key here. And some of that is just do your basics, right? Know what problem you're solving for your users. What do they value? Create user personas. Talk to your customers. Actually, I really want to emphasize this one. Talk to your customers weekly, at least. I used to say daily, but like in the beginning, you probably should be doing it daily. But as you think about continue and scaling, you want to make sure that you're creating a scalable process for talking to your users regularly. And that's really easy to do when it's like a 3-person team and you're still trying to find product market fit. You're like, oh, I got 5 customers, and then I talk to them. And It's when you start getting to like 100 people in your company. How many of those 100 people are still talking to customers? If you haven't created a scalable process upon which every single member of your team, whether or not they sit in HR or legal or dev, they should still be talking to users. Now, the frequency of that depends on their role, of course, but I want to emphasize that I think this is a part that often gets overlooked when teams start to scale and they start to get bigger, is when was the last time your CEO talked to their users? Not just the product team, not just the design team, making sure your engineers, who don't really like to always talk with people, still, at least at some point within the year, are talking with users. And then after that, we want to start adding in frameworks for growth, right? And this is really focusing on the consumer side. The aspirational one is what you see on the left. That's Duolingo's, famous chart around and really exceptional blog post about how they broke down their users into respective buckets and how they focused on ultimately what was their at-risk wows in terms of driving growth. But let's recognize they published this blog post after 11 years being in market, right? So they have spent a lot of time measuring, iterating, focusing, and adjusting. As an early stage startup, I would say it's okay, start simple. Right? Remember, keep it like KISS, for those of you guys familiar with it, keep it simple, stupid. Just have a framework which breaks your respective users down. So at Photomath, we ended up only focusing on 3 buckets of users. We basically took the top there, which was new users, active, retained users, we call them, and resurrected users. And we adjusted it for our case. So Photomath was a study learning app. It's not something that you do every single day. No one actually has homework every single day, unless you're in India. That's what we saw usage was like. Everywhere else in the world, it's like you peak during the school, you peak on Wednesday, Thursday, and you fall off on the weekends, right? And that's just because that's the cadence of which homework is assigned. And then again, in India, it was like that, because that's the cadence of which homework is assigned there. But so for new users, it's fairly self-explanatory. People who have come to the app for the first time. Retained users was anybody who was active this month, as well as active the previous month. And resurrected users were people who were active over 3 months ago. And that was really important for us, because if you thought about the cyclicality of the school year season, as you can imagine, June comes, it's summer, everyone's done studying, they all disappear for the summer, and then, hey, were we able to resurrect them come the next school year cycle? So in many different types of businesses, different ones will, different areas will be easier to move. And like I said, so at Photomath, we found that for us, the easiest category to move and the most important were retained users. So new users we were able to get relatively through organic growth, and that was driven, and I'll talk a little bit more about new users later, but that was really driven by an ongoing earned media, a lot of in-person screen-to-screen virality. That's when you have such high user delight that people will literally say, hey, have you seen this app? Hey, have you seen this? And that was actually largely how Photomath grew. We also had really good app store optimization. All this stuff became fairly cyclical. But what we recognized was that there was a really healthy ecosystem already going. What was actually really key for us then was how many users came back. How many came back the next week? How many came back the next month? And again, how many came back the next school year? For resurrected as well. And so this ultimately became our comprehensive strategy, right? So we identified first the main driver is retention. And that came from if we were able to reliably get learners unstuck. For us, a lot of it focused on homework help. And so for us, unstuck meant we could help a student with every single type of problem that they had. And at one point in time, this was all pre-large language models. Actually, different types of problems require different types of technical solutions. So even Photomath, even though we got really good at helping students, we couldn't guarantee that this week we could help you, then next week we would also be able to help you. Unless you were in certain type of, in certain areas we were better at it than others, but it was still not guaranteed. There were things like, hey, word problems are handled differently than formula-based problems. But for every single student, no teacher just assigns formula problems and no teacher just assigns word problems. And so we were constantly trying to think, okay, how do we help students get unstuck? And this became our goal. How do we get there 100% of the time? And what was interesting is that nobody could do that reliably well, but we could do it at the best, and we continued to push at it. And so this ultimately turned into what we called our content growth loop strategy. And the content growth loop was to say, okay, this is a core company process that used data gathered from learners, used powerful AI and systems to prioritize, recognize that type of information, sort it, and then how do we reliably create high quality learning and assistance around people's problems through software. And this was our flywheel of growth. We had entire charts around that. I'm not sharing it just because, it was still private information. But I think what I really want to emphasize here is that for us, it was more than just a process. When you say, okay, this is going to be our key driver, this is how we're going to implement it, now the entire company has to be structured around this. So then we organized our teams, our engineering, our product around the content growth loop strategy as well. So when I talk about it being holistic, you want to think about how you're driving everything from not just your KPIs, right? Like identified clear goals, KPIs, and then the processes and operations systems to support that. Okay, so like I said, we'll go back to a quick note on user scaling, because for many, new user growth is actually very important as well. One of the key things that I think is critical is that you either have product-led growth or built-in virality. Built-in, sorry for that typo, virality strategies are really important. Right? I know product-led growth had a huge moment, boom, bust, but it is really critical to say, hey, is there a way in order to lower your blended CAC through ways that people are going to share, either through direct network effects or through some aspect of the product that they want to drive? And the reason why I want to emphasize this slide here is from one of our board decks back in 2021 when we actually had a bunch of new entrants into the market. Microsoft had come in, and if you mentioned this previously, but like Microsoft had come in, they had copied our app to a T. Right? It was the same exact design, it was the same exact layout, UX, they had the same logo almost, they just changed the color from red to blue. The tagline in the app went from scan, solve, learn to scan, draw, learn. I mean, they did everything to mimic us, and they said, hey, it's always going to be free because they monetize obviously through many other different mechanisms. And for them, this was about attracting global youth. The other more frightening one was when ByteDance did the same exact thing. And this was because, hey, here is a product in market who knows consumer products really well. They have a marketing engine behind them like nobody else's business. And they have plenty of money to spend, right, on acquisition. So that back-to-school cycle, GothMath spent enough on marketing, which really was for them nothing because they own TikTok, 1 billion views of video hashtags within a 2-month period. Over that same period, no, this is not even over the same period, over Photomath's lifetime, we had amassed 40 million views of a hashtag on TikTok, which already is great, particularly organically. But found them going up against 1 billion views relative to 40 million. I think at that point I was scared, expletive in there. What was really fascinating about that, and the reason why I highlight it is because it's not all about new user growth. They couldn't retain their users. The value proposition wasn't there. So they spiked in the App Store, wasted a whole bunch of money, and then I would say, now that's been almost 3-4 years later, when Photomath is now out of market because it's now owned by Google, and is now starting to gain the traction and growth that they probably were looking for in the past. So new user growth isn't everything if you don't have retention, and just buying it is just too expensive, right? Even a company that large couldn't necessarily maintain it. And then to just switch over from a startup perspective, remember, yes, monitor your blended and paid LTV to CAC, right? So that's where your organic growth comes in. It helps lower your blended CAC. monitor your CAC payback period. All this stuff is highly critical now in this environment from a VC perspective, and retention still being critical. Another little quick note is like kind of TikTok and ambassador programs. We've heard a lot of this recently, is using TikTok as a mechanism for quick, cheap viral and social adoption. This has been extremely popular in the study tools this back to school season. So since September of this year, we've seen probably 4 or 5 startups, early stage, seed or pre-seed, who have reached 100,000 plus followers this school year alone. So it's a very viable strategy, but I just kind of want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of actual execution. Often very common for people to go after nano influencers. And as you build out your ambassador program, the key thing to remember is keep the content, like give very little guidelines on content, right? This is what these influencers are great at doing, is finding what resonates, particularly with Gen Z. And then, but it is important, apologies, for the ambassador to provide education on the iterative process and testing. And that's actually what this clip is. This is a really interesting one. If you can kind of see, fortunately, apologies again for the poor quality there, but it's essentially the same ad 9 times, right? And what this particular startup did is they really coached her on like, just keep iterating at it. And she essentially, all she changed mostly was the track of the music. And so some didn't hit, then she finally cost one, went from like, some were like below 1,000 views to 1.2 million to one hit 8.7 million views. Only difference, change the music track, right? And so I think this is actually one of those things when you're talking with your ambassador program and when you're saying, hey, how do you educate them? Educate them on the iterative process. Don't try to coach them on the content or what they're gonna do. That's what they'll excel at, but help them understand what it means to A/B test. And that's an area that actually many influencers aren't familiar with. And then just kind of by way of practical information, we've seen a huge variety on how people comp, everything from in-kind gifts, hey, I gave them a stand and like a better video, like a better lighting system, to all the way to rev share, had like cost per acquisition composition. It really kind of depends on that influencer marker you're going after, if they're US based, if they're not, but I'm just kind of giving you a sense that there's a really wide range today. And you can do a lot of iteration too on what's the right thing. So it could still be quite cheap from there. Right. Oops. And that's actually all I have. I think I have a little bit of time for questions, if there's any Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, for that. Please don't leave, because I do have a question. So where does this leave us in terms of exit? So this type of virality, is that something that's going to really drive valuation, or is it going to drive interest from inbound interest from investors? Where did this play in?
It's a great question. So I think in terms of new investments, and there's still an expectation for monetization, right? So driving a lot of user growth used to be the par for the course. Hey, we can, as long as we have enough users, we'll figure out how to monetize eventually.
Right.
That's
sort of
that's
Internet
gone.
1.0, right?
Yeah. I would say that lasted up to like mobile.
Okay.
Right. We're at a stage and point where you do need to show clear monetization, but it is really important that you have a user base upon which you can monetize against. So, freemium models I know sometimes have run out of favor, but one thing to take into consideration is that if you have product-led growth, then you can really drive the user base significantly, and that is ultimately, what investors are looking for. Strategic's different matter, and I think that depends on who your ultimate, if you think that you ultimately want to go IPO, or if you are going to go strategic route, what do they care about?
And what are some early signs that investors look for that a business's product, sort of exit ready? That a product is in a position where it's, it's ready to be sold? Yeah,
around what is ready to be sold, I think what they want to see is repeatable sales.
Right? So that recurring revenue stream.
That recurring revenue stream, that you have a clear idea of either how you're going to grow it or how you're going to, usually how you're going to grow it.
Got it. Okay. So it's not just the dream, it's actually the meat on the bones.
The meat on the bones, as well as, I should mention, it's not just top line revenue, it's also EBITDA margin at this point in time.
Right. But that does tend to change as the winds change, right? Right now it's pretty turbulent, so people are more focused on short-term outcomes.
I guess post 2022, the focus now is not just growth, but growth with efficiency, and that's where the EBITDA
Exactly.
comes in. Yep.
Right. Thank you very much for your insights. Thank you. Let's give our Jennifer a round of applause. Thank you.